This week on our preaching calendar that Colleen and I did up is a week that's called Preacher's Choice, which basically means we're in between two sermon series. And so whoever's on gets to choose what they're going to talk about. And so for me, in wanting to keep with the Christmas theme of the last few weeks, I selected another portion of the story. One that we see, and maybe we even hear each year, but one that perhaps we can confuse some of the details about. A story like so many that we're told about our own childhoods or the lives of other people that we can almost recite over time by heart. That we can feel like we were there for it. That we can lose the meaning of because of how many times we've heard it over and over and over again. A story that even as we look at our beautiful nativity sets isn't quite right. I realized this again a number of times over the Christmas season as I added visitors into this nativity set that's in front of us. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to the Christmas Eve service and it'll make a little bit more sense. But especially as we sat down with our own kids on Christmas Eve to do an annual tradition that we've done since they were little before bed, where we read the Christmas story and the kids place each character in the nativity as they arrive in the story that's being read. There's Mary and Joseph and the donkey who find their place into the stable. Then baby Jesus gets laid in the manger. The angel comes and rests on top. Shepherds and sheep make their way in. Each character finding their place. But then there's always this moment at the end where one or two of the kids are left with people who don't fit in to the Luke chapter 2 Christmas story. They're left holding the wise men and the camels that they rode in on, the ones who are there in our perfect nativity scenes, but who it's believed, based on what we read in Matthew chapter 2, would have arrived perhaps 1 to 2 years after the baby was born. Members of the nativity who were a little late to see little Lord Jesus asleep on the hay on that holy night when Christ was born. And as I consider that this year and reading through the story to include them in the nativity, I was drawn to a number of other things that we don't always get right about their story. The first is we typically call them wise men, a name that tends to symbolize for us wisdom or someone of the highest levels of intellect. However, in the time of Jesus, these men would have been called by something else. They would have been referred to as magi, a title given based on their training and occupation as either magicians or astrologers, depending on what you read. Men who had dedicated their lives to viewing the signs in the sky and in other places and interpreting them. Interpreting them often for people who hold the next title that we often don't get right in their story. Kings. A name they've carried in our modern world because we've immortalized them in things like songs, We Three Kings. But these were not kings. They did not wear crowns or rule over lands, though they did have the ear or the trust of kings of their time because of their unique abilities. On top of that, their story never specifies how many of them there actually were. We've assumed over time there were only 3, because that's how many gifts were brought for the baby king. But perhaps there were 4, and one remained outside to watch the camels, having lost in rock, paper, scissors. Or maybe there were 6, and they carried them 2 at a time to the front, each bringing one gift, each pair bringing one gift for him. We'll never know, but we've been taught and assumed that the number of gifts reflected the number of men who came. Each of these facts that we've seen or come to believe, indicating perhaps we don't know their story as well as we might like. And so as we've read it over today, here are the things that we do know. This story takes place during the reign of King Herod. So that's a period between 40 and 4 BC. The Magi, while not members of the Jewish people, had heard, read, or knew the prophecies of the Old Testament, so had heard of the coming birth of the king who would be born. They have identified this strange star as it rose up and followed it from their home in the east to where it was leading them. While they arrived with anticipation to meet him, the people of Jerusalem didn't seem to be looking for him at all. They hear the words of the Magi, and instead of being excited, for the birth of this promised Savior, the reaction is to be disturbed. The king, because he's worried about losing the power of his throne. The people, perhaps concerned about the effect this announcement would have on that king, their lives and futures. The Magi, while they'd seen the star and knew what it meant, didn't know where to look. And so the chief priests and teachers of the law were called to share that Bethlehem would be the location of this child. Herod shares with the Magi and tells them to find him and then come back and let him know so he can worship him too, setting in place this trap that he's hoping they will fall into. The Magi leave, the star rises again. They follow it to the home of the child. They bow down and they worship him, bringing gifts fit for receiving a king: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gifts, it's believed, that wouldn't have just been terrible things to bring for a 1 to 2-year-old, but would have a spiritual meaning as well. Gold, a symbol of kingship or royalty on earth. Frankincense, a symbol of deity, and myrrh, an embalming oil, a symbol of death. But those things aren't what we know for sure. And then we know that the Magi were warned in a dream to return a different way home and not to share any information with Herod. The details in this story contained in this story, highlighting for us something that can teach us more than the details that we've come to believe about them. Finding meaning from this story to carry out into our own lives. The first is that if we look for the signs of God's presence, we will find him. These men had spent their lives watching the stars, looking for something that they were never sure they would see. They had studied the text, spent hours getting to know as much as they could about it. And it's a reminder for us of the importance of taking the time to truly know and to look for God all around us. To get to know him in a way that we can see his presence when it appears. To identify where he is moving, the things he's doing, to be prepared for when he appears in front of us. So it's a reminder for you and I as we look ahead to the year that's coming to be into the Word, to get to know who he is, to be active in prayer, seeking his wisdom and his presence for our lives, to slow down a little bit and take our time to truly look around, to be still and know that he is God, to take time to look for the signs of his presence, and then to be prepared to follow where he's leading. The Magi tell Herod that they saw the star and came to worship him. This king who they would have understood to not be for their people. This king they were unsure of where he actually would be or who he would be. They were willing to drop everything and follow the star wherever it led them in order to pay respect to the one that they had read about, and probably many others before them had been longing to see. They are a reminder to us that we need to be ready and willing to follow where God is leading. That it isn't enough to just learn about him and watch for the signs. That God isn't looking for fans, people who will know his stats and his greatest hits. He wants us to get actively involved, to drop what we're doing and to follow him right now. To leave home, country, province, city, in order to live out the calling he's placed on our lives, to share the good news. To leave comfort, family, or work, relationships, friend groups, in order to take on the life he needs from us to grow his kingdom. To leave expectations, our own, our families, our friends, societies, in order to be something greater than we could be on our own. This story reminds us that we need to look for the signs of where he is and be ready to follow where he leads at a moment's notice. And thirdly, that this course is going to require us to be flexible. It will mean heading into parts unknown for us, having to rely on others for information like the Magi did on their journey, and to be willing to travel perhaps a longer, harder road than we might expect, like the Magi did on their way home. That the path is not going to be clear or easy getting to where God needs us to be, but that he'll guide us like a star in the sky. He's provided wisdom and others around us to help us get there. And so we need to seek the wisdom, experience, and guidance of trusted Christians in our life and in this community of believers. And that he's going to require us to be flexible, to adjust our course and head in a new direction from time to time. To trust that while it might not make sense in the moment, that where he's leading, the path we will take to get there will make sense in the end. That it will be to our benefit or to the benefit of others for us to go where he's leading us. That it might require more from us in the moment in order to be a blessing in the lives of someone else in the end. And then the last thing this story can remind us is that you are never too late to be part of God's story just as long as you show up. The Magi took up to 2 years to make their way to the child, but still find themselves every year playing a central role in the story of Jesus' birth. They weren't there on the night that it happened. They didn't get to see the baby lying in a manger wrapped in swaddling cloths. They didn't see the angel choir and hear the tidings of great joy. The child they encountered on that night when they arrived was very different than the one the shepherds had seen. He would have most likely been walking and talking, climbing and sitting. He would have had all his baby teeth, perhaps, and been eating real food at that time. This was not away in a manger Jesus. This was perhaps terrible twos Jesus. But still, they are there every year in the Nativity. They show up in the carols that we sing, taking their place in the stable by the manger. Because it doesn't matter when, but that they did show up. That they chose to be aware of what God was doing, chose to follow when he presented himself before them, chose to be flexible to God's direction in their lives. It didn't matter that they missed somewhere between 1 to 2 years of his life. What mattered was that he chose to be there in that moment. They chose to bow down and worship him, and their lives were changed forever. This is what God is asking us to do for him as well. He's saying to each of us that it doesn't matter if we've missed the signs before, if we haven't been ready to move when he called, if perhaps we haven't been willing to be flexible in the past. Whether we've been late to the game or not, he's asking us to show up now. I've shared before that my first call to full-time ministry came when I was 18 years old. I was 28 years old when we entered training college. I was 10 years late. For someone who spends much of their time running late, even this seems a little excessive for me. But God has shown me in ministry that whether I felt I was late or not, I'm exactly where he called me to be, exactly where he led me to be. That as we stand on the doorstep of a new year, 2025, here in Oshawa, this is exactly where he needs Colleen, our kids, and I to be with you, our church family, as he leads us into the amazing future that he's setting out in front of us. That following him has taken and will continue to take some flexibility as we navigate this road together. But that whether you've been here forever, showed up a little while ago, or just arrived, it's never too late to show up for him, to find your place in his story, in the 140 plus year story of his people here in Oshawa. Never too late to bow down and worship our King Jesus. So friends, there's no need to be sorry if you're late, when he just needs us to show up this time.